This
Let's.
conference will now be recorded.
All right. So, does anyone have any questions before I can move forward with the today's session? Anyone, any questions as such before I move forward? Okay, so yesterday it was mostly about how to create a virtual machine and the introduction of something called virtual machines and all these things out. So we were looking at how the first generation application development was taking place, and then how we moved to something called second generation, and where we are today, and why are we creating a virtual machine and all these things. Now, when you look at the yesterday's session closely, right, a virtual machine is just not one piece of a resource like we were having something called a storage account, but rather it's a cluster of resources like which closely interact with each other and which has a particular role to do and all these things out. And if you look at all these things, you have something called as a VM itself, the central piece of everything, which is attached to or which has its own something called as disks. So if you look at this type, it's a disk out here, and you also have a disk. So you have an OS disk and something called as a data disk. Two different things out here, OS and data. And then you have something called as a network interface card. Very, very important resource, forms the brain of, let's say, your entire architecture. We'll talk about what this is. You have your virtual network, and finally you have something called as a network security group rule. Let's understand one of the each and every components, and let's see how it forms your entire virtual machine. Actually, let's start there. Let's see how do these components, let's say, sit inside a virtual machine. What do you get with a virtual machine, all these things. So again, goes without saying, you will need a tenant, you will need a subscription, you will need a resource group, and within the resource group, so if I have a resource group already, and if I now want to start creating something called as a virtual machine out here, the first component that I'm actually looking at is a virtual network, because without a virtual network, you cannot have a virtual machine. You will need a virtual network, or you need to create the virtual network before. You need to create, let's say, a virtual network while you're creating the virtual machine out here. So any which ways, it's okay for me. So either that or this. Give me a second. Let me mute a couple of people out here. Yes, great. So I need a virtual network which gives me something called as an isolation. So virtual network out here gives me a network isolation out here, which will allow me, or which will, let's say, give me a great freedom to go ahead and create my own network or create my own space inside the cloud. And once I have this within the virtual network, is what I do have is called something known as a subnet, which is, let's say, attached to this particular virtual network. And the subnet again cannot be bigger than the virtual network. So the subnet has to be contained inside the address space of the virtual network out here. And after creating the subnet, the first component that actually gets created is called the network interface card, which attaches itself to the subnet. Now, what exactly is a network interface card? In short, we call this as a NIC card, NIC card out here. Now, very simple. Just imagine that you have a laptop, and your laptop is actually connected to the Wi-Fi. Your laptop, your mobile, or any device that you're using. If it needs to establish a communication with another device or with the internet, it needs to have a central component called as an NIC card. In our laptops, we call this as a network card or a network interface card also, which just is there in place so that you can communicate with the outside world and also resources inside your network and all these things out. And without a network interface card, you cannot have, let's say, your virtual machine in the first place as such. So the component that gets created out here is called a network interface card, and the network interface card is the one that gets associated with the subnet, meaning the network interface card takes an IP from the pool of IPs that the subnet has to offer. In my case, it is 10.0.0.4. Meaning, if you go into a virtual machine And if you look at the virtual machine out here, so this is the first VM that I created, and this is the image that I had, this is the size that I had, and etc. If I just scroll down, there is something called as a private IP address, meaning the address where the virtual machine is actually sitting in. Now, if I have to talk to someone, if I have to write a letter to someone of y'all, I need to know what is the precise address where you're sitting in, right? I need to know where exactly in this city or in this particular world that you're sitting in so that I can actually talk to you. Or even when I'm now talking to you, or when I just give you a call, I need to know your number to give you a call out here, right? And you need to know my number to, let's say, accept that particular call out here. Same way, even in the cloud world, if I want to talk to a resource, I need to precisely know in which address the resource is sitting in, and that is where your addresses come into picture. And the address that I'm talking about right now is a private IP address. And in the VM page, you are able to see that the VM has a private IP called 10.0.0.4, which is nothing but an address that is coming from the subnet of your, let's say, network out here. So if you go into the subnet, and if you look at this right now, the subnet only has 250 IPs. One IP is consumed by your VM, and the 10.0.0.4 is nothing but an address that is coming from this particular range. 0.4 out here is coming from this particular range of the addresses out there. But does the private IP directly get associated with the VM? No. The private IP gets associated with the NIC card, and the NIC card gets associated with the VM. The NIC card is actually attached, has one leg in the subnet and one leg on the VM, so that it can transfer all the communications that are coming from the subnet to the VM and transfer all the communications that are coming from the VM to the subnet and the outside world. This is how the network interface card acts as a bridge or acts as a mediator for all the communications within your network and outside your network out here. So let's do one thing. Let's go into our resource group, and before we actually come into the virtual machine, let's go into something called as a network interface, which is nothing but the VM name 836, some random number got associated. If I go in here, do you see again, you see the private address? It's saying it is 10.0.0.4, which is the private IP that I got from, let's say, that particular subnet. And I, as a network interface card, I am attached to someone called as a VM, which is called as a first VM out here. First VM is nothing but the name of the virtual machine. And if you click on this particular name, again, you'll go into the VM only. So if I just click on this one, it'll go into the virtual machine only. And I'll just scroll down into the settings of this one. There is something called IP configuration. And this is where I have the private IP address attached to. It's saying dynamic, but is actually, let's say, static, meaning if you restart the machine, you will literally have the same IP address out here. It's let's say a static IP. Privates are normally a static IP out here, and it is telling it's an IPv4 address, IP version 4, IP Internet Protocol version 4 out here, because you have a 10.0.0.4 address spaces out there that is available. So this is how, when I create a virtual machine, internally a network interface card gets created, and this network interface card goes ahead and pulls an actual IP from your subnet, and that's the reason it became 251 minus 1, because 1 is attached to the network interface card. So if you even go back into your network, let's say I go into the network out here and I go into, let's say, the subnets, and before the subnet there is something called connected devices. If I go here, it is telling a network interface card is connected to your network, and that particular network interface card is again attached to your, let's say, virtual machine out here. This is how, or this is what network interface card actually does out here. Any questions here?
Yes, Kiran. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, just there it is written dynamic. It should be
Hmm.
static because if let's say like some upgrade we done in the VM
Okay. Hmm.
or something, an issue, we restarted. So
Hmm.
what if the IP changes and every all configuration that is pointed towards the VM fails because of the IP
Okay.
address?
You can convert it into a static if you say
Mhm.
something like that. And we can go into the network interface card.
Okay.
If I go into the IP configurations, this is dynamic. If I just click on this one, I can say static and I can save this out.
Okay.
So as simple as that. So you can also, let's say, while creating the virtual machine itself, you can declare that this is a static assignment out here, and this will now save. And now your private IPs are actually going to
Mhm.
become static assignments. So you are
Okay.
now having a 10.0.0.5. You can also change this to 5, sorry, 4, and you can also change this to 5, 6, 7, whatever it is
Okay.
within the
One more
range.
question.
Then sorry to interrupt you.
Hmm.
You said the address will start from 10.0008, right? And here
Tulsi,
it
can
is
I?
saying
Yeah,
4.
just a second. Sorry, Tulsi, just a second. I was completing a question earlier, so I'll just complete that and come back to you. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry, someone was
Yeah.
asking a question.
Yes. One more question is it's a Windows server, right?
Hmm.
So let's say the like a Windows Server administrator logs in, he wants to do
Okay.
some changes to the network
Okay.
IP. So
Okay.
or in the configuration, like normal IP settings, he goes and he tries to change the IP like 04 to like let's say like 010,
Hmm.
0.10.
Hmm.
Is that possible from the
So
Windows
yes,
side?
from the Windows side, inside the server you're talking about.
Yes, yes, yes. After logging
Uh,
inside.
no, it is not possible.
Okay.
From within the
Mhm.
server, it is not possible. This is the setting where you need to come here and kind of change this out here.
Mhm. Because that would be a conflict. So I asked. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Tulsi, to answer your question, yes. Please go ahead now.
The IP address which you are saying
Mm-hmm.
10.0004,
Mm-hmm.
and you said not below 8, right? On that thing. What is that?
No. Now, when I said not below 8, that is a
Mhm.
CIDR address range. If you look
Okay.
at the
This
virtual
is
network,
different.
this is the
Okay.
actual IP address that you're getting from this particular range out here. This
Okay.
cannot go below 8. This cannot be
Okay.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This cannot be something like this. The one that I'm showing
Mm-hmm.
you right now
Mm-hmm.
is a range of address. So if I go into the subnet and, oh sorry, if I go into the connected devices, it is 10.0.0.4. I don't have a I don't have a forward slash. This is not an address range. This is the actual address. This is the actual address that you are allocated with.
Okay.
Okay. So two different things out here. Yes, any more questions here? All right. So now I'm telling that this is, or the network interface card is a medium of communication, meaning if you have to talk to this machine or if the machine has to talk to you, the network interface card is now the core component which transfers all our communication, that is incoming and outgoing. When I say incoming, incoming into the network, outgoing, going out to the network, going outside the network out here. So it's this is incoming out here, and something that goes out is the outgoing. But as of now, if you look at my network interface card, and if I look at the IP configuration of my network interface card out here, one thing that I'm missing on is the public IP address. And I was telling yesterday that a VM or a network interface card that is attached to a VM will definitely have a private IP, can or cannot have a public IP address. Then why do you need a public IP address out here? Is that in my case, if I want to communicate with my VM, and how do I communicate with my VM? there is a concept called, whenever you talk about a Windows server, there is a concept called as a remote desktop connection. And how do I do that? Is on any Windows laptop, just go to your search button, say remote desktop connection. This is an application that you get. Click on the application. It asks me what is the address to which I want to communicate to. And in my case, I only have one address, which is 10.0.0.4. And if I copy this out, if I go here, if I say connect, now it will try to establish a connection, but it will fail. Reason being, this is the address of the machine within the network, within the boundary walls that you see out here. The machine can be called, meaning within these boundary walls. So if you have another virtual machine in the same network, this machine can talk to this particular machine over its private IP. Always remember, guys, private IP communications are only and only possible within the network. But I am a user, I'm a human being, I'm a, let's say, user out here who's coming from outside the network, and I have an IP address with me. So if I do a watch my IP, I have an actual IP address with me. It's something like this. And using this particular IP address, I am firstly trying to communicate with my subnet, and the subnet will simply say, you know what, your IP is not within the range. I'll just kick you out. So all my connections to this particular virtual machine over a remote desktop or an RDP is simply telling that, you know what, remote desktop can't access to this computer because of one of the reasons, the firewall is on and all that stuff. So by default, every connection that I try to, let's say, establish to a private IP is blocked. Private IP addresses are only accessible if you are within this network, meaning if this user is within the network, only then I can go ahead and, let's say, start talking to something called as the private IP address out here. Until that happens, or until that doesn't happen, I cannot go ahead and talk to the private IP address, because of which, if you want to talk to this particular machine over an internet, that's where a public IP address comes into picture. Public IP addresses, which is a resource that I'll put outside the virtual network, because public IP addresses are not within the virtual network out here. And I can create a public IP address and attach it with my NIC card. I can associate this particular public IP address to my NIC card, and the NIC card is any which ways, let's say, associated with my virtual machine. So the virtual machine directly takes a public IP as well from that particular NIC card out here. So this is where I'm getting into. And in order to create a public IP, I'll just go into the Azure portal, and this is an actual resource. And when we were creating a virtual machine yesterday, I marked none on the public IP yesterday, and I did not create it out. But today what I can do is I can say public IP addresses, and this is a public IP address resource. And I can say create a public IP address, and it's an IPv4 address that I want to create. A standard SKU. We'll talk about why, what is standard, what is basic, and all these things out. I'll just scroll down. I'll just give the name of the IP address. I'll just say this is a demo IP address. That's it. I'm just giving a name. I'm not giving a number. Can you give a number? No, you cannot give a number. This is a random assignment. And I now have the option to set my IP addresses. And in this case, the option is blocked. The reason being, I'm going for a standard public IP address out here. And if you go for a standard public IP address, the default is that the IP address is static. There are two types of IPs that you can actually deal with. One is called dynamic, the other is called static. What do you mean by that? Is very simple. If I take the IP address associated with the VM. And in case my VM gets restarted, if this is a dynamic IP, the number can change. The number that is associated with this can change, and it can break my entire, let's say, application out here, which is the reason why a lot of companies go for something called as a static IP assignment. Static IPs don't change, meaning Azure gives you a number, and that particular number is only for your particular subscription out here. And if you go for a standard SKU, let's say public IP address out here, you won't be able to change this. But if I go for a basic, I can set it to dynamic or I can set it to static out here. So by default, I'll go with, let's say, standard, and I'll say create. Okay. There's a couple of things. The resource group is something that I haven't given. So I'll go ahead and give the same VMRG out here, EastUS2. I'll just go with EastUS2 and I'll just say create this out. So I'm now creating something called as a public IP address, which is static in nature with an SKU of, let's say, standard. And I'm just creating the name of the public IP. I do not have the actual public IP with me. I'm just going and creating the name of the address. I do not anywhere declare that, you know what, my address is something like, for example, this is my address. And if I have a power cut, this will change because this is a dynamic IP assignment that I do have. And usually everything that is, or even you, when you are, let's say, working with any kind of an internet provider like Geo, Airtel, whoever it is, by default, you are going to get a dynamic IP assignment. You're not going to get a static IP assignment out here. But in Azure, you can say, you know what, I need a static IP or I need a dynamic IP and all these things. And it now says that the IP address is created. So I'll go to the resource. I have a demo IP, and you see I have now an address, which is 2022.148.110. This is something that I haven't given at all. I did not even declare this anywhere. I did not even tell that, you know what, this is the address that I need. This is Azure which is allocating to me. This is associated, or this is, let's say, allocated to me by Azure. And what I can do here is that once this IP is created, I can associate this particular IP with a network interface card. We'll talk about what a load balancer and all these things out. I'll say network interface, and I'll choose my network interface out here. And the reason that I'm able to see this network interface is because the thumb rule here is that the IP address and the network interface have to be in the same region. It has to be, let's say, sitting in the same region. So I'll say this is the network interface card, and I'll say okay. So what I'm now doing is that I created the IP, and after creating the IP, I am taking this I'm going inside the IP address and I'm associating it with the network interface card out here. This is how I have associated with this one. So now what happens is that this particular public IP that you saw, which is 20 something like that, that gets associated with the NIC card, and goes without saying, this gets, or the virtual machine kind of gets this particular IP address, which is 20 dot something something something. So now my VM has got both a public IP and also a private IP, and I as a user can go ahead and start communicating with this particular, let's say, IP address, and this IP address communicates with this NIC card, and the NIC card internally diverts the traffic to that particular virtual machine out here. This is how the communication actually flows from one point to the other, meaning from my laptop, my machine, to the IP address, then to the NIC card, then to this particular virtual machine out here. So if I go back into the Azure portal, and if I just refresh this out, the association is now done. And now if you see, it is now telling me that it is associated to this particular card called first VM 836 out here, which is the network interface card that I do have. And if I go here, click on this one, and now this network interface card has both a private IP and also a public IP, and this network interface card is associated or attached to the first VM. And if I now go ahead and click on this particular first VM, this first VM had a private IP. Now this first VM also is taking the public IP from that particular network interface card out here. So what does this mean is that I can take this particular public IP now, and I as a user who's coming from the internet, not only me, even you, anyone coming from the internet, can go ahead, type in something called as a remote desktop connection, give this address, and I'll say show options, and I can go ahead and give the username, which is something that I set while I was creating yesterday, the admin username and the password out here. And I'm saying test user, and I'll say connect. So I, as a user from the internet, can now go ahead and establish connections with my virtual machine out here. And I mean, for that to happen, if I am coming from the internet, I I need to have something called as a public IP address out here. But yes, you still see the error. We'll talk about why this error is coming up and all that stuff. But any questions still here? Anyone? Any questions till here that I
Mm,
can take?
yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
so I mean, once we associate and it, I mean, network address translation is automatically happening, or we have to do it?
No, NAT is automatically taken care of. So network
Okay.
address translation, etc., is taken care by
Mhm.
the DNS servers that is provided by Microsoft.
Okay. Okay. So, is this IP address chargeable resource?
Yes, it's chargeable resource, and especially when you
Okay.
go for a static IP assignment, it is more
Mm-hmm.
costlier than a dynamic. So
Okay.
IP is, let's say, the chargeable resource. So that's the reason when you create a virtual machine, right? It gives
Yeah.
you that 8 rupees per an hour is the estimation just for running the
Mhm.
machine with the disk. But your IP addresses and all these things are charged additionally.
Okay. And I mean, so let's say like we are taking one IP address only, and we
Mhm.
want to convert into a domain.
Okay,
That is also possible.
definitely.
Public.
You can, yes, definitely. We'll also look at the domain names and all these things out.
Okay. Okay.
But yes, you can convert your IP addresses into a domain name as such.